Hello, everyone, and welcome to our LinkedIn Live today. My name is Sarah Barnes-Humphrey. I'm the founder and host of Let's Talk Supply Chain Blended podcast and the founder of the Blended Pledge. And I'm going to be your moderator today. Now, I've kicked off 2025 with some amazing events. I've hosted webinars, LinkedIn Lives, live shows with some of the big industry brands. And I've been on site at events in New York and Vegas so far. We're going to be in Long Beach very soon. And I'm excited to keep that ball rolling today with the incredible team at Softeon. Now, today I'm joined by Mark Fralick, Chief Technology Officer, and he's going to be joining me for the show. Now, welcome, Mark. Thanks so much for joining me today.
No, thank you. It's a great opportunity for me to chat with you and us to share ideas.
I know we're going to be talking all about introducing innovation into your operations and sustaining it for long-term success. Now, as an industry, we're seeing continued challenges and disruptions that we can't manage alone. So we're increasingly seeing a focus on integrating new technologies to help support busy teams, but also boost competitive advantage. Now, Gartner predicts that by 2028, 80% of warehouses and distribution centers will have some form of warehouse automation, with 30% of those having robot platforms by 2030. But are we really prepared for that level of innovation? Where do we find the right technology? How do we figure out what's right for our organization? How do we actually integrate it successfully? There are a lot of big questions, and we're going to be diving deep into those today and exploring how you can navigate the shift and introduce tech that really makes an impact. Now, if you're watching, if you're tuning in, I want to know where you're tuning in from. So make sure to put in a comment. Let us know where you're tuning in from. And also, if you have questions throughout the show, make sure to put those in the comments as well, because Mark and I are going to get to those in just a little bit. Now, before we dive in, Mark, can you introduce yourself and maybe give us an overview of Softeon for those that might not know?
Sure. As you said, my name is Mark Fralick. I've been fortunate enough to be in this great industry since 1988. I started my days at a company called McHugh, which then became Red Prairie, JDA, Blue Yonder. My business partner at the time, Jim Heflin, who is the CEO of Softeon now, and I are the ones that created the WMS that's now owned by Blue Yonder. We sold it to them, and both of us worked for them for a while. I went off on my own, did implementations for the last 20 years, mostly really highly automated implementations all over the world, 16 countries, I'm going to say. So not all over the world, but enough. And in 2 years ago, when Jim joined Softeon, he brought me on with my entire team, and it's been great. Softeon is well known as one of the top WMS companies out there, and so they've been in the business for over 20 years. We were the first to the cloud, and so I think it was a natural thing for me to join on with Softeon, and I'm so happy to be here, and so happy to be here with you.
Yes, and look at all these people. We've got people representing from Costa Rica, Cincinnati, New York City, New
Oh,
Brunswick, Canada. We got Canada in the house. I'm very excited about that. Being a Canadian, Orlando, Miami, Atlanta. So we've got lots of people here. So this is going to be a great discussion. I'm expecting lots of comments, lots of questions for you, Mark. Now, let's set the scene a little bit. So talk to me, like, what are the biggest challenges organizations are facing in their warehousing operations right now? Like, what is everybody worried about?
well, I think that there's a continued worry about staffing.
Mm,
And what's happened, back in the day when I started, we'd always say that people in the people working in the warehouse were at the beginning or the end of their careers, right? And so, but what's happened is people can make nice careers out of working the floor of a warehouse and get paid well and things like that. But what we're finding is that, as companies co-locate distribution centers, sort of in the same area, like literally in the same block almost, right? There's a lot of competitive pressure as far as wages, but not only wages, but ergonomics. Like, is it easier for me to work here? Do I have to, haul myself around a facility all day, running around to try and catch up? All those things really drive the labor component
Hmm.
as much as anything now. And so I think that the dynamic of that is really, really interesting. And so when we talk about how to solve that, it is a myriad of options out there. And frankly, I think it's what might be a problem is so many options out there. ProMats in a couple of weeks where you go out there and almost be lost in the sea of technology trying to get to the floor. Where do I go? Where do I start? What's the ROI? And so it's a really difficult, for a lot of people, can be a really difficult set of dynamics to navigate, I think.
Yeah, well, and you bring up a really good point, and I hadn't really thought about it, but they have all, you're right, warehouses are to group together in these one locations, and so they really only pull from a certain pool of people that live within a certain radius because I mean, who wants to drive an hour or two each way anymore? I mean, since the pandemic, nobody wants to do that.
Right, exactly. And like I said, the dynamics shifting a little bit toward, the workers having a bit more power in term, as that's happened, like you go across the street for 10 cents an hour or stay here because, the work might be a little bit more aligned to your physical abilities or the pace of things or the way they motivate you as an associate on the floor. So there's so many things that play into when people say, oh, there's a labor, there's just a lot of elements that feed into that dynamic, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So, why do you think innovation and leveraging technology like robotics and automation is so important in tackling those challenges? And I want to, also be clear in the fact that there is a labor shortage, but we also want humans, I think, to work with the robotics and the automation because there's certain things that people don't want to be doing anymore.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm fully with you. And I think that, kind of look at the way things have gone, there's really that that whole like, hey, we have to attack the labor shortage problem, but that's really not necessarily the main objective that some
Mhm.
business or many businesses have. Let me give you the example. So let's say that you're in a business that's highly dependent on the busy season, from, let's say, a couple weeks before Black Friday
Right.
through mid-January, mid-December, right? Um, that is a scale of that is, as much as anything, a scalability problem, right?
Mhm.
So what I like to do is I like to talk about more about, like, is the what's the objective if like 80% of your business is in that range of days. Like, think about every day as an opportunity to make or break your business for the year. um,
Right.
if that's it, that's a scalability thing, right? That's a scalability issue, meaning that you can't just throw labor at that to solve it potentially, right?
Mhm.
Because it's impossible to potentially do that. So a combination, the right combination of technology, robots plus associates, right, could yield you the best opportunity to make your numbers during that short window where you have to really make some hay and to make your numbers for the year.
Okay.
So let's talk about that. I like to talk about it from the perspective of, yes, there's a labor thing, and FTE, full-time equivalents, sort of at play, but there's almost always, as much as anything, a scalability question in
Mhm.
mind. So I think that starting with that, you could start to think about like how you can navigate things if you're trying to solve for just, if all your volume is steady across the year, you might be thinking about it more from a full-time equivalent, managing that and growing your business with maybe the same amount of people or a few less. But I think more people have the bigger problem of saying, look, I got a scalability problem in this window or these windows through the year. How do I
Mhm.
navigate that?
Yeah, the seasonality, right? I think about some of those Halloween stores.
Yeah.
And the logistics behind those, and I think I talked about this on a show a few years ago, is the logistics behind those Halloween stores and how seasonal it is and how there's a mad rush for a certain period of time, and then there's a complete lull for months on end, and trying to fulfill roles and bring on additional people and staff is quite difficult.
Yeah, I actually did one of those sites of those like Halloween sort of stores, not exactly that, but I mean, it was similar. And yeah, that's the worst possible situation of scalability because they literally have 30 days, right? Kind of like in that range, right?
Yeah.
And they have to make they make 95% of their money in those 30 days where people are
Mhm.
thinking about Halloween or so I think you're right. So when I think what happens is that when people go to a show like ProMat and they get inundated with all these ideas, they lose sight maybe on a main objective, right? Is your main objective solving that scalability problem, or is your
Mhm.
main objective to say normalize the way we deal with staffing over the boundaries of the entire year,
Mhm.
and then also then maybe the robot companies have done a really nice job of saying, hey, we'll do robots as a service, so your busy season will be able that you can essentially hire some robots for 3 months of the year. So I think what happens is that customers, to the original point, is they look at this and they're trying to understand their own objectives, and then see how the technology or the way the business process for that can work within their facilities.
So, why do you think that we're seeing this acceleration of robot platforms now? Do you think that we are getting more clear in the objectives and exactly what we're looking to do with robots? Whereas before it was kind of like, I know they're there, I see them, they're really cool. I'm just not sure how I can implement them in what we're doing currently.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that what I think is going on is um, we have the meeting of a couple of situations. One, when 10 years ago or so, when Amazon bought the only real game in the business for it created a vacuum in the space, and that while it was it was inconvenient for a year or two, that vacuum was filled by a massive amount of innovation and different thought processes around how to do things, moving shelves, individual assistant pickers, all these sorts of things came along, and so now you have all that has reached the ability to be prime time and a lot of different variations of those things, right? Just as people are saying, holy cow, I got a staffing problem that we need to deal with, right? So
Right.
now you have the fortunate situation where, while it was unfortunate, a little bit unfortunate for the industry for a year or two, that Amazon took the main guys that were doing this off the market, it created a vacuum which caused a massive amount of innovation. That innovation now is fairly mature, and now the prices are coming down. It's more competitive. There's more options from a commercial perspective. Just when we need that from the perspective of getting a handle on our FTEs and our scalability problems. So it's a meeting of those two sort of situations that have really caused us to move forward more quickly.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see where people are sort of finding the gaps, where leaders are finding the gaps in how to use some of these systems. Now, we know we need to incorporate innovation into our warehouses. We've kind of established some of the challenges and what that looks like. But how do we navigate that journey? And we've talked about some of you know, um, the obstacles. We've talked about what people should be thinking about when they're thinking about implementing some of this technology. You mentioned that sometimes we get overwhelmed by being at trade shows like ProMat. I've just been at Manifest. I know that you guys were there as well. So, where do we find technology? Where else can we seek out technology to see who's on the market, but also to try to find an understanding as to whether they're the right fit for us, right?
Yeah, I think the way to do that, especially if you're going to go to a show like ProMat, but really to start the process, really you have to set a North Star for yourself and say, look, this is the main problem. This is the main objective. And if we had to solve all kinds of different problems, if we didn't solve this one thing, the introducing of this technology is a failure. I mean, it literally has to be something like that, because otherwise what happens is you kind of get dragged in different directions. And the last thing that you want to do is say, look, we're just going to take some low-hanging fruit, right? Without that North Star, because let's say you take some low-hanging fruit, let's say shuttles from inbound staging to, put away, so autonomous vehicles doing that. Great, that's awesome. You got some low-hanging fruit, but now you have charging infrastructure, tech infrastructure, and stuff like that is revolving around a vendor that may not actually help you get to your North Star, which is solve a bigger scalability problem. And now all your charging, now you got all that electrical work that was done to make this happen. So if you're gonna shoot at the low-hanging fruit, I think that's great, as long as it also helps you achieve your long-term North Star goals. So I think that could actually be a good way of doing something, to say, look, we know we're going here. We can also take on these smaller things as proof of concepts along the way, as long as they keep supporting the end goal that you're trying to, again, that one thing or those few things that if you don't get these done, doesn't make any difference what all the rest of those things are, because they're inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. So that's, I think, get a North Star, make sure you don't make short-term decisions, and move along.
I think that's such an important point, right? Before you go into any discussions, you really need to figure out what that focus is, because you can go in a variety of different ways. And those potential technology partners are going to talk about the different ways that you can utilize their system and how it can help and all that kind of stuff. But you're right, in that moment, some of those things might not make sense. So you have to think about and focus on in the moment, but then also think about that North Star and kind of what's coming up next that they could potentially support you on as well. So it's a really interesting balance in some of those conversations that you're going to have with possible partners and technologies. But once you've found like a multitude of possible partners, technologies, how do we sort through all of that? Because it's a very competitive market. There's lots of different providers, and it's not like you can just try out a few first, or as far as I know, you can't. How do you vet the options, better understand the providers and their offerings, and make a decision that's right for your organization? I know the North Star, I know the focus, but like, are there specific things that we should be thinking about, maybe questions we should be asking?
Right. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the nice thing is that when 10 years ago, when that vacuum occurred, right, a whole bunch of folks got into the market, and now they've actually matured, right, to the point where their sales processes have matured. So you can actually get from most of those robot vendors and most of the goods to person, we call it GTP, whatever those kind of techs, you can actually get them data, and if you feed all the competitors that you're asking the same data around, number of shifts per day, potential, in your peak season, what's the volume, in your non-peak season, what's the volume, how does that project in terms of how many FTEs, full-time equivalents I need, how much technology I need. Every one of those vendors now have matured their processes enough to be able to give you, a very clear idea of what the costs are, and the return on investment, which is always important if you're taking, this to the board and things like that. And then also, they've matured to the point where some of them have minimized the amount of capital expenditure. So now it becomes more of an ops sort of, operating capital perspective. So now you can say, you can use that as a variable too, to say, look, this is not going to go against my CapEx budget. This is an OpEx thing. And then it spreads out over the life of, several years. And it actually almost looks like just a variable expense to you. So I think that all of those things, luckily, as I said, we have this fortunate situation where those things have all matured just when we need them. And so I would be asking the same exact question to all the and make sure that they have the accurate information and are returning, FTE numbers, bot or equipment numbers, how much space they need for charging, and then also, projections on return on investment, where we should be asking those questions, and you should be able to get good answers from all the vendors.
So I go back to my comment about testing, and I'm just going to sort of throw this out at you. Can you test? Is there a way to test? Because I mean, at the end of the day, this is a big investment on both sides, right? It's a big investment for the tech company and the tech partner provider. It's a big investment for the customer. Is there a way to test to see if it's the right fit or not? And should we be asking about that? Like, is there a testing environment? I'm not sure what that looks like.
That is difficult because there's a lot of infrastructure,
Yeah,
but
that's what I was
here's what,
asking.
here's what many of them will do. If you say, look, we shouldn't have a cavalier attitude toward the final steps. Obviously, no one wants to have you're making a generational decision, really, from an organization perspective, to
Yeah.
make this right. And whenever we get into this situation, the first thing I always say is, look, I get it. We're making an organizational, generational shift, right? So we have to take all of this stuff very seriously. But the last steps sometimes are the most difficult. And one of those last steps could be a pilot. And I strongly advise people to write the contracts in a way to say, look, we really believe in your stuff, right? You've given us these FTE numbers, these ROI numbers, and let's take one of our sites and do a pilot. Usually you can arrange that at a reasonable amount of cost. Obviously, you're adding some, on your side, on the customer side, you might have to add some additional, electrical runs or something like that. But all the rest of that should be, just considered pilot. And if it doesn't work out, the vendor should allow you to just, remove it. And so I think, again, as those vendors have matured in their business models and it's gotten more competitive, not only are they doing things like, robots on demand and things like that, they're allowing in a lot of cases people to do pilots and say that in that last step, let's verify everything that we've talked about on paper.
Right.
That's the best way. There's people that will say, okay, come and we'll set up a pilot, and or we'll set up a test in this facility, in our test facility. That never really yields much to me in terms of like real life. This is accurately depicting how in my operation I'm going to save time, or I'm going to do the process.
Yeah. No, I'm so glad that you shared that, because I don't feel like we talk about pilots and testing enough, and I think that was great. So just a reminder to everybody in the audience, we've put some really great resources in the comments. If you haven't seen it, go grab those links. But also, if you have any questions, make sure to put those in the comments, because we're going to get to those in just a little bit. How are you guys liking it so far? Send me an emoji. I want to hear what you're thinking right now as well. Now, you mentioned operations, and I think identifying and choosing the right partner is the first piece of the puzzle, right? But then you have to tackle the next big challenge, and that's actually getting it into your operations. And I think different providers will have different processes, but I think we can talk about this a little broadly. So, how do you think that an organization can effectively add a new system with the least amount of disruptions? Are there any guidelines or best practices? We just talked about a pilot, right? But this is really going one step further from that. So are there any guidelines or best practices that you can share to help anybody looking to bring that into their operations?
Yeah, that's actually a really terrific question, and it's a really difficult one. Reality
I
is
never
that,
said today would be easy. Just saying.
oh, and I'm all in on that. I'm all in on that because the reason I've been in this industry for so long is, one, I've been able to work with some of the most brilliant minds, operations and software and stuff that I've ever encountered, and it's been great. But the technology is always changing, and the problem space is always changing, and it's just the most fun space to work in. But this is a hard question because depending on the sort of technology you're leaning toward, that may it may be more conducive to a stair step sort of rollout, right? So robots as an example, that's a situation where you could, as part of the pilot or the next step after the pilot, roll it into a portion of your warehouse and just have a robots area. And it doesn't have to take over the world necessarily. Just draw some lines around it and say, hey, no humans in this area, depending on, what you're doing. And so you can sort of navigate yourself into that and expand as you prove out, the reliability and all the rest of that jazz. If you're taking on a GTP, a goods to person, where there's actually a fairly extensive build out, that's really impossible to do, right? Because somebody's gonna spend 4 or 5 months building out this 3-dimensional storage grid or something like that, and that's going to be not possible to do without basically having a land grab. You have to make a land grab in your facility, or if it's in a greenfield, the site's going to be built around the GTP. So it just depends on the kind of devices or kind of the technology, and how much of a land grab inside of your facility it's going to be to incorporate that. Robots tend to be the least amount because the only land grab, and I'm just talking about square footage they take up, for things like chargers and things like that. That's a relatively easy thing. A lot of times, if you already have electrical, vehicles charging, your fork trucks and things, it's just you already have the runs made for electrical service. All you have to do is get some additional charging stations. When you're talking about a goods to person, you're talking about a bigger footprint of something, and you just need to plan for that. And it's as soon as you start doing that, it's just you can migrate your way in there to make sure all that stuff works effectively. But that big 30-foot tall, 60-foot wide thing is there now, and there's nothing to do but go forward with it.
That's true. Well, and that kind of brings me to my next question about pitfalls. Are there any, what are the biggest pitfalls to look out for when you are bringing it into something like this into your operations?
The biggest pitfall that is, this is even from way back when I first started, the biggest pitfall is just changing business. So, you can't always be sure of what the business looks like, the order profiles, what people's ordering behaviors are, what kind of product affinity we have. We know that, hey, pet supplies, there's a lot of affinity between item numbers. Health and beauty, there's a lot of affinity between those item numbers. Not a lot of affinity between health and beauty and pets stuff, right?
Right.
In a single order, right? So all those things are things that we can plan for, right, and try to account for, but we cannot, you don't have a crystal ball that says, hey, people are going to be shifting toward this new way of doing things, and it's going to leave us, not having the same sort of order profiles, or we're going to have a change in the way we go to market. So I think that part of this is to say to yourself, all right, how nimble with this technology can we be if our order profiles change? Or what is this to our order profiles? What we find now is, when I entered this in this industry, we're all just doing conveyor stuff. And that's the worst possible bolt down technology for when something has to change. Because
it takes so much space.
Yeah, the conveyor is going that way, right? It's going that way. If you have to then send it off to, different chutes and different, it's a major infrastructure change, right? What the robots, and I'm just going to focus on robots for a second. The advantage of the robots is it's not a big infrastructure cost from an FMO, for facility maintenance perspective. It's if you get the commercials right, it becomes almost like hiring robot employees, because you're basically doing robots as a service, this much per month for robots. And if things change, you can say, boom, you're out of here, this other technology is coming in. Or you can change the way your robot services work and things like that. So I would say I lean toward less bolted down technologies myself, but the new GTP stuff, the goods to person stuff, is so compelling that, if you're in the business of fashion wear, soft goods, that's not going to change, right? Your order profiles and things are going to change, but that is a really good use case for a goods to person thing, no matter what happens, unless you get into shipping bowling balls next week or something
Mhm.
crazy, right?
So
So
something a little bit more
yeah,
flexible and agile, because at the end of the day, we can only plan so far. Things are changing all the time. We don't know what's going to potentially happen 6 to 12 months from now. And so you want to be able to bring something in that is agile, flexible, and can move with the times and sort of the future of the business.
yeah, exactly. But also within the constraints of the business you know it as today. Like, for instance, like I said, if you're in apparel, you're in, footwear or something like that, you're going to be in footwear. And so the order profiles might change, which might lean you a certain direction in terms of how you service them. But you know that the footwear is going to be, or the apparel is going to be served well out of this technology, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah. And I want to give a shout out to Alejandro over on my personal. He says, very excited to identify North Stars for the medium and long term in the warehouses and build strategic plans. Plus, John, I see your question. We're going to get to that one in a little bit. Now, one last question in this particular section that I have. I'm always talking about how technology implementation, digitization is really 20% the technology and 80% change management and teams and how we handle training and thinking about change management. Do you have any sort of tips and tricks when it comes to this particular technology on how to support teams through this journey, thinking about that change management, that training, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I definitely do. Probably about 10 years ago, we changed the way we implement. I was, as I said, doing really highly automated facilities for the last 20 years. And we realized that we had been doing it wrong, that we were thinking about testing and validation as a phase instead of as a core element of everything that we think about. And so what that drove us to do is we created this challenge and refine process where we're challenging the vendor all along the way. We're challenging us, our operations all along the way, and we're challenging everyone to make the right calls on things. So what that means is you bring ops in early. You bring ops in early to help with the process of defining the parameters, getting things situated, understanding, what the associates are going to be asked to do, maybe
Mhm.
get some initial feedback from the employees, get some initial training up front. The pilot of that helps. But I would say ops early and often is the best solution, because what then can happen is they can say, okay, this is what we like, and we can get some initial training, set for
Mhm.
these folks. When things are made in the vacuum of like, hey, this is an IT thing or whatever, and I love my IT brothers and sisters out there in the world. What happens is that we forget about things like, oh, we have 50 associates per shift that need to be trained, and they might have some input about how to, again, they're worried about if we don't make this ergonomically correct, we're going to lose people across the street to, the next DC
Yep.
down the street that's offering 5 cents an hour more. And
Mhm.
so all of those things, I think, early and often get ops involved, make sure that they're part of every decision process and the steps so that they can validate that, yeah, training will be easy. These should all be what sometimes we call consumer grade sort of apps that somebody coming
Mhm.
off the street can recognize, oh, I know how an app like this works, and just get on with it. And so I think all those things are really important. Training and testing and training is not an event. It's a process that needs to be handled throughout the entire part of the project.
Yeah, well, and I think innovation comes from uncomfortable conversations. I think we all try to shy away from those conversations, but really that's where the magic happens. It's where the innovation happens. It's where we get people on board when they feel seen and heard, and we just, get into the messy and come out so much better for it. Now, I want to talk about ROI, because when we talk about technology, we talk about implementations, whether it's robots, warehouse automation, you name it. People are focused on the ROI. Leaders need to show the ROI. They need to show their leadership. They want to make sure that they're contributing and making an impact to the organization. So, how should teams be thinking about utilization and visibility to make sure they're making the most of a new technology and then seeing the impact? And I find a lot of times with technology, we only use what, like 40%, and there's so much more that we could be doing. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, as I was talking about before, All the current vendors that are out there, of any size, will do ROI projections. So I think that becomes not your goal, but only a low watermark, right? Because
Okay.
that's how I would view it. Say, okay, because that's the number that somebody up above us, right, has in their mind, that's the ROI goal, right? And if you don't at
Right.
least hit, but that shouldn't be like your goal. That should be a low watermark for you,
But
right? And
shouldn't
so,
they all be on the same page as to what the goals and ROI? Because sometimes I think that is kind of the foundation, is that we all have different ROIs and goals and we're not actually aligned on it.
yeah, right. Well, so I'll give you an example. You're exactly right. And I'll give you an example of what that means. So the question about scalability goes back to, like, from an ROI perspective, like, are you worried about the 95% of the year where you have this working, and you have a couple associates and a few bots, and maybe it's a fairly, it's almost a break even. Do you really that from an ROI perspective, or do you care about the fact that you're not going to have to hire 100 temps for
Mm,
2 months out of the year, instead just basically bring in a few extra robots to do the work?
right.
What is your ROI challenge at that point? And to me, I always say, look, what we should be doing is saying, yeah, we want to do this over the year, but really, as you scale your business, aren't you going to be measuring that ROI about how much it costs you to serve your busy season? Because
Mm,
that's the big chunk of your revenue. And right, you want to decouple the costs from, you scaling the business. You want to decouple the costs so it's not linear anymore, right? And so now you can say, I can get robots as a service for 2 months out of the year. We're adding, $1,000 a robot extra time. We're not adding, we're adding maybe a few extra associates to the floor. But now you're not coupled. Your ROI, your ROI is decoupled. Decoupling your costs from your busy season. So I think sometimes I always challenge people on that, to make sure you're thinking about that correctly, because it may not be just, hey, it's this much per year. It's about how well we scale the
mhm.
business and keep that revenue generation and costs decoupled.
Yeah, and we are getting a lot of fire emojis, which means that people are loving this conversation. They're loving the insights that you're sharing, Mark. So let's keep this going. And again, we'll get to some questions soon. If you have any, put those in the comments. Now, when we talk about ROI, we can't talk about ROI without talking about KPIs, right? Everybody loves a good KPI, or maybe they don't. They just say that they do. How can teams set the right KPIs to ensure they're measuring that return on investment that you talked about?
Yeah, I think that's the harder part of things. That's a super awesome question, because that's a harder question, because remember I said that each vendor is going to come with their own way of doing these projections, right? And of course, because of that, they are coming with their own KPIs to to create that measurement, right? And so I think what happens is that it ends up being a very mushy thing, because some vendors think about things one way and some vendors think about things another way. And by the way, here's a big trap. Do not let the first vendor in the door define the conversation, right? So what I can
Hmm.
tell, a lot of times sometimes I can tell when a customer comes talking to me and the language they use, I go, oh, well, this vendor's in there because that's their language for KPIs or for measurements or things like that. And so I would say, as part of the North Star, right, don't let a vendor sort of, don't let their speak control your objectives, right? And so yeah, the KPIs are all over the place. I think that, so one KPI, right? For instance, we were talking about like ergonomics,
Hmm.
um, and like let's say a fulfillment operation. One of the things that you can, as if you're trying to hire associates, you could say, look, we don't require you to run around the facility picking all this stuff. What we'll do is we'll either put you at a very comfortable station, or we'll put you in an aisle, and then robots will come to you. So here's the question, that I think operations should be asking is, can we think about one of the major, KPIs, ergonomics for our associates? So that's something that people don't often bring to the table as a measurement, but like how much travel are we asking that person to do? Because for instance, if you're trying to hire people and you don't require them to walk very much, the frankly the age and athletic ability of that doesn't become as big of an issue when you're trying to hire new associates. So I think KPIs go beyond just how many picks per hour, which all the vendors will bring as part of their measurements. It's got to be more than just picks per hour. It's got to be things that are meaningful to you, solving the problems that you want to solve beyond just picks per hour, which is fine. You get that from everybody. Right. But going back to that labor shortage issue or the labor dynamics, you have to be able to look at other issues beyond just that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so true. And there's so many things to think about. But again, being aligned on those KPIs and what that means. Okay, let's get into talking about Softeon solutions specifically. And then we're going to address all of the audience questions that we have right now because they are stockpiling up and we've only got 20 minutes left. So talk to us about like what is multi-agent orchestration and why is it so hard?
Yeah, so what happens is people don't really understand sometimes that, let's say that they're getting goods to person system, for picks, and that actually comes with, the problem of how to get product and conveyance and things like in there and product out of there. And so that might be done by robots. So this idea that you have just a single solution that solves all your problems, that is not the reality, and it's not the reality you want as a customer, as an operation. You want the best possible pieces of the puzzle, and so what this whole multi-agent idea is, and something that we've been working on for 5 or 6 years prior to coming on to Softeon, which was 2 years ago. So about the last 7 years, we've been thinking about this, is how do we create a single structure for dealing with all the different kinds of vendors, robots, GTP, conveyance, in a way that everybody can talk together, because that's the reality of what's going to find its way to the floor. And you don't want to just be threaded through one vendor's version of what that looks like. And obviously, I'm very passionate about that topic. And so that's you want to give options. You want to be nimble. You want to have the business be able to go where it needs to go next. And I think that a good multi-agent solution like that will help. And it's obviously something we put a lot of work into.
Yeah, and you don't want limitations, right? You really want to see the opportunities and what the sort of the art of possibility. And that's what partners really bring to the table. They bring that innovation and that mindset. So how are you helping that, making that easy for your customers? Like talk us through, you've got a warehouse management solution, you've got a warehouse execution system, and then you talk a lot about your expert team. Can you put all of that together and how you make that easy for your customers?
Yeah, I think that it comes together, and obviously we've got a lot of passion for the work, and we look at it again from the perspective of always what's the right thing to do. I love the right thing to do because it works in life and it works in WMS and warehouses. So the right thing to do for the customer. We don't make calls on vendors. We bring the vendors in, or we help choose the vendors based on how they're going to work because we have the ability to do our WES and our WMS. We can help coordinate all the elements of that. And the key thing is, and I know we want to get into questions, is like we just try to do the right thing for the customers, technology-wise, innovation-wise, bringing the right software, having the right partners, our own partners, and just doing the right thing for the customers is our big goal.
So let's explore maybe one of those use cases. Can you give us an example of how Softeon has empowered organizations to optimize outdated systems with, your industry leading solutions? Talk to us about that. Paint us the picture. Like what was the problem they came to you with, the solution, and sort of the benefits?
Right. So, we recently had a customer come to us, and they have a little bit of older conveyor system, and we wanted to move that into a more automated approach. And the hardware vendor, the conveyance vendor, was in there, saying, okay, you got to rip out all this stuff in order to actually communicate to the outside world. We used some of our tools with something called the Elastic Communicator, which can plug in to PLCs and pick-to-light stuff, and actually make it so that they didn't have to make a capital investment just to replace an aging WCS, and then they can move the needle forward in terms of getting better flows to their associates, getting the whole system to flow better without actually having an extra piece of plumbing like a external WCS or WES to upgrade and maintain. So where they were going to have like the starting point of like I got to replace everything, which is $100,000 just before they can get to audit, increasing the performance and usability. We removed that hurdle and just said, okay, we got you covered, and with our technology. So that's my favorite thing. That's one of my favorite stories.
I love to hear that, because like when you're thinking about, oh my goodness, I have to rip everything out and I have to sort of start from scratch. Nobody wants to hear that, and nobody wants to think about the investment that comes with that.
Yeah, because it basically just gets you to where you are right now, but with stuff that has less dust on it.
That is such a good point. Nobody wants that. All right. One of the things that I've mentioned throughout this discussion is that we've put in some really helpful resources into the comments. So I highly recommend you go and check those out. One of those is that you have a really helpful robot and goods to person selection guide that we're providing to attendees. They can download to find out more. Can you give us a bit of an overview of what it is, what people can expect from the guide, and sort of how it can help them?
Yeah, it's very much like what we've been talking about. When I was approached to write that, I said, well, I don't want it to be like all the other selection guides out there, which is very esoteric and blah blah blah. And I said, let's take this from an ops perspective. Like, what are we trying to do here? It talks about setting that North Star. Don't fall for these pitfalls. The 5 pitfalls of that you're going to run into. Just it talks about all the elements that we just talked to, and it's not a blah 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 piece. It's very much a hey. In my experience of doing automation for the last 25 years, I work with ops people all the time, and the finance people, to get the capex versus opex stuff right, and talks about all those things, and in a very pragmatic way, not a salesy thing. There's not one salesy thing in there. And it's just me explaining, how I think you need to approach things from a real life perspective, not an esoteric one.
So if they weren't taking notes today, they need to go and download that guide to give them all of the insights that we talked about today. I love it.
Yeah.
All right, let's get to some audience questions. So we've got a question from John. I'm going to put it up on the screen here. It's a fairly lengthy one. How is Softeon leveraging AI and machine learning within its WMS and WES to optimize real-time decision making, particularly in balancing labor management with dynamic order prioritization? And then there's a second one there about predictive analytics evolving within the platform to enhance throughput and minimize operational bottlenecks. Big one, Mark.
Yeah.
I know you can handle it, though.
Yeah, thank you. That is one of the biggest areas of our investment, actually. So there's a notion of predictive. You use the predictive AI. So let's just very quickly. There's a lot of people lob AI into one bucket. There's generative AI. There's predictive AI. There's causal AI. There's things like that, right? So what we've been doing, obviously, we've got a AI configuration advisor. That's an example of a LLM, a chat, thing. But what this person is talking about is using this to get information about what has historically been going on in the facility and use that in a predictive way. So the nice thing about, and I apologize, but here's my big complaint about WMSs historically is WMSs know all, tell little. And so what we have to do as WMSs is be better at sharing our information. So like, hey, we often don't hear about, things that are going on in the facility from the WMS unless there's some kind of issue or something completes correctly. We as WMSs need to be better at giving more information. The more information feeding into something like an AI engine, ML engine, the better. And so what we've been doing is spending a lot of time saying, okay, how can we create more observations, because these systems can consume a lot of information. let's get more information about flow, let's get more information about issues photo eyes and things like that, into our system, and be able to consume that information in a way that now we can feed that into AI engines using Spark or something like that to get that stuff in there. So we're trying to correct the historical issue with WMSs, which they don't tell people enough information about what's going on. We're doing a lot in that, and then getting that into an ML engine where we can now to say, okay, we have predictive and causal. Predictive is like predicting the fact that, hey, we're going to get a spike here because on a daily basis we get spikes, or every third Thursday we get spikes. And then causal AI to say, hey, you know what? When we see these sorts of events together, we know that there's going to be a problem in a downlink. So those are two different versions of AI that we're doing a lot of work on.
I don't think that challenge is specific to WMS, though. I think it's an industry-wide challenge around the data sharing issue, right?
It is. It totally is. People get very, oh, this is my data, and or they just don't think about exposing it because they don't think anybody's going to care about it. We are taking the antithesis of that. We created an infrastructure called activity streams where we could take massive amounts of information in. We don't know who that might be pertinent to, but people, any ML, any system, a labor system, a resource, system, can subscribe to any of these sorts of events, observations, and it might be useful to them. We're getting out of the business of making predetermination of who those things are important to.
And it's kind of biased, right? Because we really don't know what we don't know, and at the end of the day, we're making decisions about data that
exactly
really isn't useful to anybody. All right, we've got another question from the audience. How will the new AI agent technology impact the labor shortage situation? Now, I literally just 2 thoughts and coffees ago spoke about an article that talked about how AI agents is, the disruptor in 2025. So I love this question because it's something that in that article said that everybody should be thinking about AI agents. So talk to us about this. How will it impact the labor shortage?
Yeah. So if you think about that from this it's an industry sort of 4.0 kind of viewpoint, where industry 4, this version of incarnation of our industry is about something called cyber physical systems, right? And and that just means that a combination of intelligence, and the physical system sort of interacting together. So right now we have bots out there that are they're doing some optimization around, like, hey, I got these 6 picks to do, I know the right path to do, and I know these other bots. And that's like the first version of all of this. What's going to start to happen is, I think that with the increasing use of these cyber physical elements, and to the point of this question, which is the next step of this, is to make more intelligent agents that now become able to say, okay, now it's time to release my set. Instead of hanging on a planner, release the picks. I have an understanding of when those picks need to be released, or when the doctors need to be cleared out. And just, it's going to change a lot. I would say where I see this going is eventually to the point where our warehouses are fairly pretty self-guided, and then the folks that are there are about handling exceptions. And that's where I think we're not going to get there just in 2025, but this next step of cyber physical stuff is going to move the needle forward. And that's where eventually it's going to get to, is that the planners, the coordinators are going to be really handling exceptions, not getting in the day-to-day of releasing waves. And we're going to have agents, intelligent agents, to do those things.
So fascinating and interesting as to what we can do and sort of what that future holds around exceptions management, which is really what we should be doing, creatively, right? It brings out our creative side, our strategic side, and that's what we, I think, as humans really want to be doing. So last question from the audience, because I got to get to one final question that I have for you. How can businesses ensure that automation and multi-agent orchestration remain scalable as their operations grow? I mean, again, we talked about this earlier, right? It needs to be agile and flexible because we just don't know what the future holds.
Yeah, and I think that whatever approach you take from a integration perspective, what's helpful is that if you start to don't think about every single piece of automation you add as an interface. Like, just thinking about every one of those things as a separate interface doesn't get you a coordinated, system. So think about that as a little bit more holistic. And as soon as you start to think about that as a little more holistic, then you start to shift into more of a plug and play mode. You can say, okay, well, I'm just going to plug this next vendor in. And it doesn't become so much of like, oh, I got to worry about these interfaces, for this particular new guy that we're going to bring in here.
Right.
If you do this correctly, it becomes almost more of a plug and play infrastructure. So allowing your multi-agent orchestration engine just to say, okay, there's a new participant here and they're doing this. And again, we're exposing events to it, to say things like that, and it's exposing events to us. That's really the next step of everything. And that's the important thing for us to become a bit more free in terms of bringing innovation in.
Absolutely. All right. So finally, then, what is one thing that you want people to walk away from this discussion doing, thinking about, taking action on? What's your one main takeaway?
You can come to me at ProMat if you see me and say, I did think about this and this is it. Is what are the one or two things that if you take on automation and you don't do, your project becomes a failure. So what is that North Star that you need to define in order for you to say, there might be other success criteria, payback, blah, 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 whatever. But what are those one or two things that you need to define? You as an organization, don't let a vendor do it for you. Don't let vendor speak get involved. Don't let a vendor frame the question. Not that they're bad, folks. It's just a natural thing. Don't let outsiders frame the solution for you. Get your North Star set. Get an immutable set of those really high level goals, and say this is what I'm after, and that's what we're going to achieve, and these are what we're going to measure ourselves against. That's the main thing I would ask everyone to do.
Such great advice. I mean, it's so easy to get lost in the multitude of choices and possibilities, and many organizations just don't have the level of knowledge necessarily required to pick it all apart. So it's been fantastic to hear, Mark, you share your wisdom, demystify the processes a little bit, and be really generous with your expertise. I mean, everyone can go and download Softeon's guide now. There's a lot more resources. Everything's in the comments on LinkedIn. If you're over on my personal, we're going to update it in just a few minutes with those links. If you want to find out more about Softeon, you can go and check them out at softeon.com. But that's all we have time for today. A big thank you to all of you for listening, watching, commenting. We're grateful for all your contributions. And Mark, thank you so much for joining me today.
I had a blast. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.